Yes, I went to Stanford and then University of Minnesota, and this is the research I did as a graduate student. And you can see me in my sweater. I wear these hoodies long before they were called hoodies, and back then I had a big head of hair. So we were busy getting ready to fly experiments on these large helium-filled balloons, and in this picture we're struggling to keep the thing from launching before we're ready. Then after I graduated, I went to the NASA, the Goddard Space Flight Center, and was there. In the middle, I'm proud to have gotten some kind of an award, and then I came to the University of Denver, where I can do exactly what I want to. That's great. So, some perspectives a little bit to start with. We are not faced with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather one complex crisis which is both social and environmental. That was Pope Francis said that in Laudato Si. And then Martin Luther King said, "Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle. The tireless exertions and passionate concerns of dedicated individuals." And I wager there are some in this audience who meet those criteria. We're currently experiencing the worst spate of species die-off since the loss of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. That's from the Center of Biological Diversity. And I've been looking recently at what happened at the Permian extinction, and it's quite trouble is we can't talk about that today. It's just too much to talk about. So when I was about 10 years old, my father started taking me on hikes up Bear Creek Canyon on Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado Springs. The hike started in a little glen with a stream where we often had family picnics. It was a lovely place like those you have all enjoyed in the mountains. We would hike up a trail for about an hour and then start heading cross-country off the trail. Dad said he was going to show me something neat. We came to this gravel slope with no vegetation, a slope of what mountaineers called scree, and taught me to scree down the slope. Yes, the noun and the verb are the same. It was fantastic fun. Has anyone else here ever done it? Yeah, isn't it great? I could jump and fly about 10 feet down the slope with each step. It took about 3 minutes to get back down to the picnic area with the, oops, I lost my place here. The picnic area laughing all the while. We took this hike a few times while I was growing up. It was a special time for me and my father. Then I went away to college, and when I returned for summer vacation, I suggested we go skiing in Bear Creek Canyon. Dad got a kind of funny look I hadn't seen before and said, "Oh, Johnny, we don't do that anymore. It's bad for the environment." I was flooded with mixed emotions. On sorting them out, I had visions of all the gravel we had pushed downhill into the beautiful picnic area. Maybe rainstorms now wash gravel away more easily. But I had started to come to grips with the idea that respect for the environment meant I couldn't do everything I wanted. And then more awareness came with this picture that was taken from the moon, Earthrise. You're all, I'm sure, have seen it, I mean. And we now know that the Earth's surface temperature is controlled by this very thin layer of atmosphere. The greenhouse effect in that little thin layer keeps the planet warm and habitable. Earth's surface is where we live in our collective commune. So let's talk a little bit about commons. I was taught that the mountains are a common, an area for the common enjoyment of all. Once too many people crowd into the mountains, something is lost for everyone. The concept goes back to an 1833 article by William Lloyd and developed more fully by Garrett Hardin in an article entitled Tragedy of the Commons. The English had common grounds where cows and sheep were grazed. Grass was plentiful, green and tall. Put a few livestock on it, they thrive and farmers prosper. Food and income are sufficient. However, the incentive for an individual is to add more cows and sheep to the pasture. But once there are too many, overgrazing kills the grass, and their owners face a crisis. We can think of the commons as a metaphor for the conundrum we face as a society. When resources are plentiful, growth and acquisition of wealth can exist. When the sea is full of fish, fishing can feed the multitudes. When land is plentiful, settlers can find homesteads. You can think of numerous other examples. When we reach what I call saturation, the state where the resource is exploited at its maximum, we have to move to other solutions. We establish institutions to regulate fairness that allow us to manage the resource and prevent the equivalent of overgrazing. Now we come to climate, where we are facing problems on a global scale. Sharing and fairness issues involve whole nations. We have realized that the atmosphere is being polluted with so much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that we are all in danger of slow cooking ourselves to extinction. Oceans, supposedly owned by all but in the care of none, are becoming warmer, more acidic, and filled with plastic, threatening food supplies. Finding solutions involves whole nations and the global population. So now let's think a little bit about justice. So the first thing I did was I went to the dictionary, or maybe this is the dictionary. The quality of being just, righteousness, equitableness, or moral rightness was the definition that I found of justice. So equitability implies balancing between different people's needs and wants. Morality and righteousness take us into a somewhat more subjective and spiritual realm, but most of us have a feeling for equity and fairness. I guess it's sort of like, you know good sex when you have it, I guess. So in the light of this preamble, what is climate justice? Climate is easy to define, except that it is often confused with weather. Climate is the long-term average of the weather. It is often said, if you don't like the weather, change clothes. If you don't like the climate, move. But when the temperature becomes dangerously hot, this won't work. And if you don't have the means, moving isn't so easy. And we have all heard about climate refugees. Justice is a bit more ephemeral. Is everybody okay? Can you hear me all right, everybody? It is a more recent concept in the course of human history. You can find books on the history of justice. Paintings appeared in the 16th century, going back to the Greeks, Aristotle, and Plato. The concepts of justice were not those of modern society. The concept of justice, or what we might more properly call social justice, is relatively new. The dictionary gives the definition of justice as, I think I read that. Okay, here are a couple of slides. First of all, let me note that everything evolves. There's a list. You can read it yourself. But justice is on there too. And that's reflected in a couple of these images I have. One, paintings. One was from 1566. If everybody's heard of Giuseppe Arcimboldo, I assume. Of course, I had never heard of him. And I've never heard of N.I. Laspina, and I couldn't figure out what the N and the I stood for. But you see, justice in the beginning has the familiar scale in her left hand and the blindfold, but she's got one hell of a big sword in her right hand. And then in the modern picture, the scale is there. You can barely see it. It's in her right hand, hanging down from her right hand. And her blindfold is obvious, but there's no sword. The sword represents authority in ancient times, conveying the idea that justice wielded by authority was swift and final. That's what the sword is supposed to represent. And I suppose there's a few kings who said, off with his head. You know, they used a sword for that, I guess. So climate justice is working at the intersections of environmental degradation and the racial, social, and economic inequities that it perpetuates. To kind of summarize, we all know what we mean by climate. The presentation will focus on its relationship to justice. Justice itself is, of course, one of the modern myths by which we try to live. A value many of us have agreed is important for society. We have uncountable example of how justice is not served. Can justice be served and sustained in a future in which the environment is further degraded by human activities? Every living person and creature depends on the environment. The first to feel the effects of the climate crisis are the least privileged and the most vulnerable global citizens. They also suffer the most damage. Climate change is causing temperatures to rise globally, resulting in sea level rise, drought, floods, fire, and resource scarcity. You all have heard this many times. This in turn leads to famine, civil unrest, armed conflict, and other suffering. As the climate falls apart, communities, families, and lives are threatened. Some people become refugees, while others try to protect themselves from refugees. Protectionism and tribalism raise their ugly heads. It will not be fair or just. We could spend a long time on this, but I think you are familiar with the consequences that we are already seeing of climate change. Climate justice values ecology and justice together, since there will be little environmental health without socio-economic justice and vice versa. The term sustainability has a parallel but more secular emphasis. Climate justice is also remembering those displaced or hurt economically as we move off carbon fuels to renewables. How can we help coal miners make the transition to new livelihoods? How can we help people displaced by floods, drought, and rising seas to relocate? We need to take steps to mitigate these effects on the vulnerable populations. So now I talk a little bit about moral codes. I recommend a little book entitled A Moral Code for a Finite World by Herschel Elliott and Richard Lamb. Some of you will remember that Lamb was the governor of Colorado from 75 to 87. Their thesis is that any ethical system is mistaken and immoral if its practice would cause an environmental collapse. So they relate the morality to the environment. I think I practice what might be called communitarian ethics. Communitarianism is not new. Most of the world's great religions, clearly Judaism and Christianity, are in a sense communitarian. These are communities of faith out of which the individuals develop a sense of self and responsibility for others. In this thinking, ethics cannot be separated from the ethos of the tribe. The new communitarian, the feminist, the environmentalist, the advocate for social justice, etc., may or may not be religiously inclined, but each is clearly part of an ancient tradition of ethical approach. Yuval Harari, in his book *Sapiens*, argues that concepts like justice and honor and caring for each other are myths that we choose to share and live by, just like the myths of gods or whatever. As such, they are fragile agreements among people that can collapse at any time. This is consistent with the thought that any moral system only survives if it is followed. If scarcity sets in, people may no longer follow any moral and ethical precepts, no matter what agreements we have. Absolute from above or communitarian by mutual agreement. So can something like human rights survive? Let me digress for a moment to talk about human rights. Human rights might be thought of as part of social justice. The basics of fairness would be met if everyone had their human rights met. Human rights can be divided into two categories. The first are those that restrain governments from restricting things such as our right to free speech or how we pray. The second are those that require resources. The latter include things like the right to food, shelter, and medical care. When resources become strained, these latter rights can become difficult or impossible to meet. It is these latter rights we are concerned with here. They represent minimal conditions for a decent life. Once the resources necessary to satisfy all human needs become insufficient, our options will be bracketed by two extremes. One is to ration resources so that everyone may share the inadequate supplies equally. In the limit, no one has enough for survival. So that can't work. You have heard the stories, people can end up as cannibals. The other extreme is to have people act like players in a game of musical chairs. In conditions of scarcity, there will be more people than chairs, so some people will be left standing when the music stops. Some self-sacrificing altruists will refuse to take the food that others need, and some will perish. However, others may not play by the rules. Rejecting the ethics of a universal and unconditional moral law, they will fight to get the resources they and their children need to live. The instinct to fight for survival and for our children's survival is especially strong. Many consider the climate crisis and simply see the need for individuals to adapt and survive. Those who think ahead and are resourceful will have the best chance. Survival of the fittest. Nature acting at its most basic level. However, this will certainly result in suffering for those with fewer resources or options. Can this kind of ethic ever be a just one? So, well, given all that, what do we do? Well, let me see. Here's a couple of slides. First of all, let me give you a little bit of perspective. Here is the timeline of Earth. And the Earth, well, gotta watch out where I touch. The timeline of Earth and life, the coevolution of life. And the Earth was 5.6 billion years old. And there, in the very little last circle at the very right, are humans. And it's hard to put that in very much perspective, but I've done it the following way. If the Earth were 24 hours, Homo sapiens only appeared about 0.16, or about a sixth of a second before midnight. So we ain't been here very long. And so, when we think about all these things and climate and what will happen, the planet will be fine. It is our species that is at risk. All but the most primitive species are extinct that have been around ever since the beginning of the Earth. Most of them are extinct, and we may be too. It's just a matter of when. Now, recently there have been a couple of articles in the New York Times. Maybe you've seen them. One was about water and the looming crisis of water facing everybody all over the world. And they have maps of where it's going to be the worst and so on in this article. And then 2 days later, climate change threatens our food supply, the UN warns. And so these were the kind of dire warnings that we were getting. Now, we know that climate is interconnected globally, both environmentally and socially. Fixing an interconnected world demands communitarian ethics. This is a communitarian problem involving the commons of the earth. Solutions will require us to work together for the common good. Protecting the basic human needs for food, shelter, and health is helped enormously if we live in a stable world, care for it, and carefully husband its resources. The tragedy of the commons is intimately connected to our economy. Our economy depends on growth. A growing economy requires a growing population or an increase in productivity. A growing population requires more resources. In a finite world, I don't see the size of the earth growing, do you? A growing population, in a finite world, the mathematics is straightforward. It cannot go on forever. And we are ill prepared to see the end until it will be too late. The net result of a dependence on growth in a finite world with finite resources will be collapse. The ethics of scarcity, or maybe before scarcity arrives, the ethics of the commons is a pragmatic ethics. It builds on the idea of constraint, mutually agreed and enforced. It must rely on trade-offs, not rights. It must specify who or what gains and who or what loses. What new basis can we find for distributing scarce resources fairly and equitably? Or do we just allow the strongest and the most powerful to make the rules? I was struck by this quote from John Winthrop. John Winthrop was a lawyer. He was his family were wealthy landlords in England, and he was the founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He came over on a ship by the name of Arbella. It was the lead vessel of 4, and he gave, shortly after they sailed, he gave a speech which basically talked about the city on the hill they were going to in America. And that's where this phrase that Ronald Reagan used so effectively. Part of this I wanted to grab out of his speech. There are 2 rules whereby we are to walk one towards another: justice and mercy. The practical application of these principles, centered on loving one's neighbor as oneself, upon this ground stand all the precepts of the moral law. That's what he said in, 1630, I believe. So what are we going to do? Well, everyone is a miracle. Humans among all species have the ability to cooperate, even with people we don't know. And that's something, bees can all cooperate, but they know each other in the hive. What we can do is cooperate with people we've never seen or never met. And together we can do what needs doing. And as Winston Churchill said, we just need to keep calm and carry on. But individually, so I posit that human beings will be unable to physically evolve on a timescale necessary to adapt to a warmer climate. We might be able to adapt using our brains and our ability to cooperate. Undoubtedly, our brains have made it possible to come this far, despite the comings and goings of ice ages and other natural disasters. Most other large mammals have not been so fortunate. So what are we to do? Actions by individuals has always been the agent of change. I recycle, I insulated my house, I bought an electric car, and purchased part of a solar farm. It's a job. Just do it. The planet is ours. Let's do what we can to keep it livable. Think of it as a contribution to justice amongst all peoples, here, now, and future generations. But ultimately, the challenge is beyond individual actions. It will require cooperation of governments worldwide. That is why I believe the Paris Agreement was so important. It was the first time all the countries of the world cooperated on something that had to do with the climate. So you've all heard the final word, vote. So here you've seen this list. I have a few more slides we can just go through. I won't read that unless anybody has any questions about any of those things. Maybe the one will surprise you most is get used to nuclear energy. They are working on new forms of nuclear energy, and the technology has become a lot better, and the dealing with the waste, which is always a problem, and the fissile materials that can make bombs, different kinds of nuclear energy can help mitigate that problem. So I put nuclear energy on the list. Plant trees. Well, we could all go down to the Amazon, I guess, and plant the trees back there. God, that's terrible. Locally, there's something called the Center for Eco-Justice. It's been, somebody have a question? This has been started at the Iliff School of Theology, There's an inaugural conference called the Intersection of Water and Environmental Racism, October 24 to 26, if you're interested in that. They just selected a head for this center, Professor Miguel de la Torre. He's committed to the pursuit, advancement, and research of social ethics, and he will study how religion affects race, class, gender oppression. And let's open it up for discussion now.